His eyes held mine a beat too long, a flicker of surprise morphing into something unreadable. It was then, mortifyingly, that I felt the silk slip further down my shoulder, the delicate strap of my dress abandoning its post. "Mark," I choked, fingers scrambling to adjust the fabric. "I didn't hear you." His mouth opened, then snapped shut, his gaze abruptly fixated on the polished hardwood floor of my Upper West Side apartment. "I knocked," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You must not have heard." I spun back to the mirror, my reflection a chaotic mess of blush and disarray. My cheeks burned crimson, a heat that had nothing to do with the summer air. Mark lingered in the doorway, hands jammed deep into his jeans pockets. "Sorry," he mumbled, clearing his throat. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine," I said too quickly, my voice wavering, too shaky to be convincing. It wasn't fine, not really. The truth was I'd been lost in my own world, standing before the antique vanity, the hairbrush moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. It was a ritual, a way to quiet the city noise that seemed to seep into this brownstone, especially when the apartment felt too empty, the loneliness wrapping around me like a familiar, unwelcome coat. It had been empty a lot lately. Mark had moved back in a few months prior, after college, his grand plans for law school indefinitely postponed. Of course, I'd welcomed him. He was my stepson after all, and the silence after Robert's death 2 years ago had become unbearable. But his presence had stirred something unsettling within me, something I wasn't ready to name, something that made moments like this, his unexpected arrival, his lingering gaze, all the more fraught. I turned fully from the mirror, pulling my robe tighter. "Did you need something?" My tone was sharper than intended. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around his jaw, but recovered instantly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Just wanted to say I'm heading out, meeting some friends downtown." "Oh," I managed, my heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "That's good." He nodded, but remained rooted to the spot, his gaze flickering back to me, then away again, suddenly engrossed in the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. "You look nice," he said, after a pause that stretched taut with unspoken tension. His voice was almost a whisper. I froze, unsure if I'd actually heard him. "What?" "The dress," he clarified, a faint flush rising on his own cheeks. "It suits you." "Oh," I repeated, my fingers clutching the silk of my robe. "Thank you." He lingered for another agonizing moment, his hand hovering near the door frame before finally stepping back into the hallway. "See you later," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Later," I echoed, my voice barely audible. As his footsteps faded down the hall, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands trembled as I reached for the hairbrush again, my reflection in the mirror now a stranger's face, flushed and unnerved, too aware of the man who had just left. What was wrong with me? I was 52 years old. I had been a wife, a mother, a stepmother. I knew the rules, the boundaries, the expectations. And yet, in that moment, everything felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice cracking underfoot. I sank onto the vanity chair, my hands gripping the edge of the cool marble, staring at my reflection. The years had etched their story, lines around my eyes, a softness where firmness once resided. But they had also given me something else, a quiet strength, the assurance of someone who had weathered storms, loss, the relentless march of time. Or so I thought. Now, with Mark back, that confidence felt like a distant memory. He had a way of looking at me, steady, thoughtful, unflinching, that peeled back my carefully constructed layers, leaving me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't felt in decades. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment, a trick of the mind, the product of too many quiet evenings alone. But as I sat there, the warmth of his gaze still lingering, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the small garden behind the brownstone, its light painting the overgrown ivy in shades of emerald and gold. Tools and weathered wood were scattered across the flagstones, remnants of my abandoned attempt to repair the old shed. The motivation had been elusive, like so many things lately. "Need a hand?" Mark's voice startled me, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to find him standing a few feet away, hands back in his pockets. He'd changed into a plain white tee and work boots, his dark hair slightly mussed, a hint of boyish disarray that belied the man he was becoming. "I thought you were meeting friends," I said, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. He shrugged, a casual lift of his shoulders. Plans fell through. Figured I'd stick around, see if you needed help with this. I hesitated, glancing at the tools, the dilapidated shed. The truth was, I could use the help, but his presence, so close, sent a flutter of unease through my chest. It's not exactly thrilling work, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. He smiled, that easy, lopsided grin that always managed to disarm me. That's fine, not looking for thrills. Before I could protest further, he stepped past me, grabbing a hammer from the scattered pile. What's the plan? His tone was light, but expectant. I sighed, realizing there was no graceful way out. The roof needs stabilizing, I said, gesturing towards the sagging corner of the shed. I was going to replace some beams, patch the shingles. Mark nodded, already scaling the rickety ladder propped against the side of the shed. He moved with a natural athleticism, the kind that came from years of sports, his muscles flexing with purpose as he reached the roof. I watched him for a moment, unable to ignore the way the sunlight caught the curve of his shoulders, the strong line of his jaw. I shook myself, turning my attention to the pile of wood at my feet. "Pass me one of those beams," he called down, his voice snapping me out of my reverie. I lifted a beam, handing it up to him. Our fingers brushed as he took it, a fleeting contact, yet it sent a small jolt through me, a spark I tried to ignore. For the next hour, we worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic pounding of the hammer, the occasional rustle of leaves in the city breeze. It was steady, satisfying work, and I found myself easing into the rhythm. "Careful," I called as Mark shifted his weight on the roof, the old wood groaning beneath him. He glanced down at me, a teasing smile playing on his lips. "Worried about me?" "Worried about you falling and breaking your neck," I retorted, though the warmth in my tone betrayed me. He laughed, a deep, rich sound that resonated in my chest. "I'll be fine," he said, brushing a hand across his forehead. By the time we finished stabilizing the roof, the sun was sinking below the Manhattan skyline, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft pink. Mark climbed down from the ladder, his shirt damp with sweat, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Not bad for a day's work," he said, stepping back to admire the now stable roof. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Not bad at all." He turned to me, his expression softening. "You've been doing this kind of stuff all by yourself, for the most part, huh?" I admitted, brushing dirt from my hands. Mark frowned slightly, his brow furrowing. "You shouldn't have to do all this alone." "I'm used to it," I said, though the words felt hollow even to my own ears. He stepped closer, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You don't have to be." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter now, "for helping." He smiled, that same lopsided grin that made something in my chest ache every time. "Anytime," he said, his tone light but meaningful. As we began gathering the tools, the silence between us felt different, not uncomfortable, but charged with an unspoken energy I couldn't quite define. When we were finished, Mark grabbed a water bottle from the porch, handing it to me. "Here," he said, his fingers brushing mine as I took it. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely audible. He leaned against the railing, watching me as I took a sip. "You work too hard," he said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. I glanced at him, startled by the comment. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you do everything for everyone else," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But who's looking out for you?" The question hung in the air, heavy, unanswerable. I looked away, focusing on the water bottle in my hands. "I'm fine," I said after a moment, though the words felt weak, unconvincing. Mark didn't respond right away. When I finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, his eyes steady on mine. "Well," he said softly, "if you ever need someone to look out for you, you know where to find me." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my breath catch. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The sun had almost disappeared now, the first stars beginning to glimmer in the darkening New York sky. Mark pushed off the railing, stretching his arms overhead. "I'm going to grab a shower," he said, his tone casual again. "Okay," I said quietly, watching as he headed toward the brownstone. When he was gone, I stayed on the porch, staring out at the garden. The tools were put away, the shed repaired, but the ache in my chest lingered, an unfamiliar and unsettling weight. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew it was something I couldn't ignore. The storm rolled in just after sunset, a slow, ominous build of dark clouds that swallowed the last vestiges of daylight. By the time the rain began, a steady drumming against the windows, the city outside was nothing but shadows and mist. I sat curled up on the couch, a warm cashmere blanket draped over my legs, a glass of red wine in my hand. The living room felt cozier than usual with the storm raging outside, the soft glow of the floor lamp, the faint crackle of vinyl spinning a melancholic tune on the old record player. It was the kind of night that begged for stillness, for introspection. Mark walked in, his hair damp from the shower, dressed in a plain black hoodie and sweatpants. He hesitated in the doorway for a moment, as if unsure whether to join me, then stepped inside, carrying his own glass of wine. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, gesturing to the other end of the couch. "Of course not." He settled in, stretching his long legs out, leaning back against the cushions. For a while we sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the rain filling the room, punctuated by the occasional rumble of distant thunder. "I forgot how much I missed this apartment during storms," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "It does have a way of making you feel tucked away from the world," I said softly. He glanced at me, his eyes catching the warm lamplight. "You're good at that, you know," he said. "Good at what?" "Making a place feel like home." The words were simple, but the way he said them, earnestly, without hesitation, made my chest tighten. "Thank you," I said, lowering my gaze to the glass in my hands. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I mean it," he said, his voice quieter now. "When I think about this place, about growing up here, it's not just the apartment I remember. It's you." The warmth in my chest twisted, shifting into something more complicated, an ache I couldn't quite name. "Mark," I said softly, my voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to make it weird." "You didn't," I said, though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm. He nodded, but his expression remained guarded as though he didn't quite believe me. The tension in the room was subtle but undeniable, a weight pressing against the quiet moments between us. "It's been hard, hasn't it?" he asked suddenly. I looked up at him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "Since Dad," he said, his voice soft. "It's been hard for you." I swallowed, the familiar lump rising in my throat at the mention of Robert. "It's been an adjustment," I said carefully. "That's putting it lightly," he said, his tone tinged with a faint bitterness. "You've been doing everything on your own. I don't know how you do it." I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of his words settling over me. "You just do what you have to," I said quietly. Mark shifted closer, his expression earnest. "You shouldn't have to do it all alone." The sincerity in his voice, the way his eyes held mine, it was too much. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "I'm fine, Mark," I said, though the words felt brittle, hollow. "You don't have to be," he said softly. The rain grew louder, a steady rhythm against the windows, and the silence between us stretched out, heavy and unbroken. "You've always been the strong one," he said after a moment, "holding everything together, even when it wasn't fair to you." His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt my breath hitch, the sting of tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. "I didn't have a choice," I whispered. "You did," he said, his voice steady, "but you chose to stay, to care for me, even when I didn't make it easy. I'll never forget that." I looked at him then, the raw sincerity in his expression cutting through every defense I tried to hold on to. He wasn't a boy anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. But in that moment, he looked at me with a depth of understanding that felt far beyond his years. "Mark," I said softly, my voice trembling, "you don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "You spent so much time looking out for everyone else. Let someone look out for you for once." The weight of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice, made my chest ache. I wanted to say something, to thank him, to brush it off, anything to lighten the moment, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely audible. He smiled then, a soft, lopsided smile that made something in my chest tighten. "Anytime," he said. For a while, we sat in silence again, the rain continuing to fall outside. The tension from earlier had softened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. It lingered, subtle and unspoken, in the quiet way his gaze flickered to me when he thought I wasn't looking, in the way my heart raced whenever his hand brushed against mine as we passed the wine bottle back and forth. By the time the storm began to ease, the apartment felt warmer somehow, the quiet hum of connection between us impossible to ignore. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind a city washed clean. Dew clung to the fire escapes, and the soft gray light of an overcast sky filtered through the windows. The quiet was different now, not heavy, not suffocating, but alive with something unspoken, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of every glance, every word. I'd spent most of the morning moving through the apartment, trying to busy myself with small tasks, tidying the bookshelves, wiping down the counters, folding laundry, but no matter how much I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to last night. Mark's words lingered in my mind, looping over and over. You don't have to do it all alone. I didn't know what to make of them, or the way he had looked at me, his gaze steady, unwavering, as though he saw something in me that I wasn't ready to face. I was in the laundry room folding a pile of fresh towels when I heard his voice. Need a hand with that? I turned to see Mark leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He was dressed simply in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly mussed, as though he'd just rolled out of bed. No, I said, my voice coming out a little sharper than I intended. I've got it. He didn't move, didn't take the hint. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his expression thoughtful. You've been at it all morning, Gita, he said. You should take a break. I'm fine, I said, turning back to the towels. Fine, he repeated, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. You always say that. I glanced at him, startled by the edge in his voice. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, leaning against the dryer. It means you don't let anyone help you. You act like you've got everything under control, but I can see how tired you are. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. I'm not tired, I said finally, though we both knew it wasn't true. Mark tilted his head, his gaze searching mine. When's the last time you did something for yourself? Something just because it made you happy? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't answer. I folded the last towel slowly, my fingers brushing over the fabric as I tried to think of a response. I don't have time for things like that, I said eventually, my voice quieter now. That's not an answer, he said, his tone gentle but insistent. I turned to him then, the weight of his gaze making my chest tighten. Why does it matter? Because you matter, he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt my breath hitch, my pulse quickening as I looked at him, unsure of what to say. Mark stepped closer, closing the distance between us until he was standing just a few feet away. Let me help, he said softly. Just this once. It's just towels, I said weakly, though my voice trembled. It's not about the towels, he said, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. I turned away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady myself. The air between us felt charged, the kind of tension that made every breath feel too loud, too heavy. You make everything sound so simple, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It is, he said, his voice steady. You just have to let it be. I felt his presence behind me, the warmth of him close enough to make my skin prickle. He didn't touch me, didn't move any closer, but the space between us felt impossibly small. Mark, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't... What? He asked, his tone gentle but unyielding. I turned to face him, my breath catching as I met his gaze. The look in his eyes, steady, searching, made my knees feel weak. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, but he wasn't backing down either. It's not easy, I said finally, my voice breaking. I'm not asking for easy, he said. I'm asking for real. His words cut through every excuse, every defense I had tried to build, and I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to, he said, his hand brushing mine, the touch so light it sent a shiver through me, not alone. The touch lingered just for a moment, but it was enough to unravel me. My fingers trembled as they brushed against his, and I felt the warmth of his skin, the steady strength of his presence. I wanted to pull away, to say something that would break the moment, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he took my hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles against my palm. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet hum of the dryer filled the room, the faint scent of clean linen hanging in the air. When he finally let go, the absence of his touch was almost unbearable. I'll be in the kitchen, he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. If you need anything. He left without another word, and I stood there in the stillness, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. The air felt different now, the quiet charged with a new kind of tension, something fragile, something dangerous. And as I stared down at my empty hands, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to let it go. The night was eerily still, the earlier rain leaving behind a cool, damp hush that settled over the city like a blanket. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty glass of wine in front of me, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Sleep was a distant prospect. The events of the day, the quiet tension that had hung between us, replayed in my mind like a broken record. The way his hand had brushed mine, the way he'd looked at me as though he could see straight through every wall I'd built. It lingered, relentless and unshakable, and then there was the way I hadn't pulled away. I ran a hand through my hair, sighing deeply, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a moment, a fleeting lapse, nothing more. But the ache in my chest told a different story. The creak of a floorboard made me look up sharply. Mark stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim glow of the hallway light. He was barefoot, dressed in a plain black t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly mussed as though he'd been tossing and turning. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. He stepped into the kitchen, the soft padding of his footsteps on the tile sending a faint shiver down my spine. He poured himself a glass of water, leaning against the counter, watching me carefully. "You've been quiet," he said after a moment. "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied, my voice barely audible. Mark nodded, setting his glass down on the counter. "Want to talk about it?" "No," I said quickly, the word sharper than I intended. I softened my tone, avoiding his gaze. "It's nothing. I'm fine." "That's the second time you've said that today," he said, his voice gentle but insistent, "and I don't believe it." I looked up at him, startled by the directness in his tone. "Mark, Just tell me," he interrupted, his gaze steady. "What's really going on?" His question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. I could feel the tears stinging at the corners of my eyes, the weight of everything I'd been holding back threatening to spill over. "It's complicated," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Then start with something simple," he said, stepping closer, the sincerity in his voice, the quiet patience making my chest tighten. "I don't know where to start," I admitted, my hands twisting together in my lap. Mark moved to the chair across from me, sitting down and leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Start with what you're feeling," he said softly. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat, but the way he looked at me, steady, unflinching, made it impossible to hide. "I feel lost," I said finally, the admission breaking free in a trembling whisper. Mark didn't respond right away. He waited, his silence gentle, encouraging me to continue. "I've felt that way for a long time," I said, my voice barely audible. "Since your father passed, since you left for college. This apartment, it's so quiet now. It's like I don't know who I am anymore." I looked down at the table, my hands trembling slightly. "And then, you came back," I said, my voice breaking. "And I thought it would help. I thought having someone here would make it easier. But instead..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Instead?" he asked gently. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Instead, it made me realize how much I've been missing, how much I've been pretending that I'm okay when I'm not." Mark's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a wave of warmth through me that made my breath catch. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, his voice steady. I wanted to believe him, but the fear of what it meant, fear of what I was feeling, was too strong. "Mark, this is..." "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "It's complicated. It's not supposed to happen, but that doesn't make it any less real." His words sent a shiver through me, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "Just let me in. That's all I'm asking." And I felt the tears spill over then, hot and unrelenting, and I buried my face in my hands, unable to hold it back any longer. Mark's chair scraped softly against the tile as he stood, and then he was beside me, his arms wrapping around me in a warm, steady embrace. For a moment, I resisted, the walls I'd spent years building trembling under the weight of his touch. But then something in me broke, and I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as I let myself cry. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice a soothing whisper against my hair. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." The words settled over me, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe them. I don't know how long I stayed there, wrapped in his arms, but the warmth of his embrace and the steady rhythm of his breathing soothed something deep inside me. When I finally pulled away, his hands lingered on my shoulders, grounding me in a way I didn't think I needed until that moment. "Thank you," I whispered, wiping at my eyes. Mark tilted his head, his expression soft but serious. "You don't have to thank me for caring." His words settled over me like a bomb, but they carried a weight I wasn't ready to unpack. I stood, stepping away from him, needing space to gather my thoughts. "I think I should go to bed," I said, my voice shaking slightly, but as I moved toward the doorway, I felt his hand close gently around my wrist. "Wait," he said softly. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in his eyes stopped me in my tracks. "I need to say this," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "because if I don't, I'll regret it." "Mark, please, just let me say it," he said, stepping closer, his grip on my wrist loosening but not letting go. The silence between us stretched heavy and trembling as I nodded, unable to form words. He let out a shaky breath, his hand falling away as he ran his fingers through his hair. "I've been trying to ignore this, to pretend it's not there, but I can't. Not anymore." I stared at him, my chest tightening as his words sank in. "I don't know when it started," he continued, his voice trembling, "but somewhere along the way, you became more than just—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. "More than just what?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. "More than just my stepmother. You became everything." The air left my lungs in a rush, and I felt as though the floor beneath me had disappeared. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling, "you can't mean that." "I do," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady now. "I know it's wrong. I know what people would think, but I can't help how I feel." His words left me breathless, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of emotions, fear, longing, guilt, and something else, something I didn't want to name. "This isn't fair," I said, shaking my head. "Not to you, not to me. This isn't right." "Maybe it isn't," he said, his tone soft but unyielding. "But it doesn't change the fact that it's real." He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming, his gaze locking onto mine. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it, to say anything that would put an end to this, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth I had been running from, was that I did feel it. Every look, every touch, every moment we had shared over the past few months had built into something I couldn't ignore. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling at my sides. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Then don't think," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just let yourself feel." Before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, the space between us dissolving as I let the pull between us take over. His hands cupped my face, his touch gentle, reverent, as though he were afraid I might shatter, and then his lips found mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching at the front of his shirt as the kiss deepened. It was everything I hadn't known I needed, his warmth, his strength, the way he held me as though I were something precious. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath hitching as his hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer. "Mark," I whispered against his lips, my voice trembling. He pulled back just enough to meet my gaze, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice raw, "and I will." I stared at him, my heart racing, my mind a tangled mess of emotions, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't tell him to stop. Instead, I kissed him again,